The wind across the high plains was a lonely sound, a sculptor of stone and spirit, and Elias Thorne was its masterpiece. For 10 years, since the silence had first fallen over his homestead, the wind had been his only constant companion, its mournful howl a fitting chorus to the quiet ache in his chest. His ranch was a testament to a life lived in the margins, a place carved out of indifference and maintained by sheer, stubborn will. The cabin, built of sturdy pine, stood as a solitary sentinel against the vast, unending sky, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at an expanse of sagebrush and dust that mirrored the landscape of his own heart. Each dawn, the sun would bleed across the horizon, painting the cruel beauty of the land in hues of orange and rose. But for Elias, it only signaled the start of another day of methodical, soundless labor. He mended fences that bordered nothing but more emptiness, drew water from a well that quenched only his own thirst, and spoke only to his horse, a stoic beast as taciturn as himself. His past was a locked room, the key long since lost in the dust of memory, a place where the echo of a woman's laughter and the phantom touch of a small hand on his cheek were ghosts he both craved and feared. He was a man whittled down to his essential parts, duty, grief, and a profound, unyielding solitude. It was on a day when the sun beat down with a merciless intensity, baking the very air until it shimmered, that a new sound disturbed the familiar symphony of wind and silence. It was a thin, reedy cry, almost lost in the vastness, a sound of such profound misery that it snagged on the hardened edges of his soul. He'd been tracking a stray calf, his eyes scanning the cracked earth near the dried-up arroyo that marked the southern edge of his property, when the sound came again. Not a coyote pup, as he first suspected, but something undeniably human. He tethered his horse and moved toward the source, his worn leather boots making soft prints in the pale dust. There, huddled in the scant shade of a skeletal mesquite tree, was the source of the cry. A woman, or what was left of one. Her dress was torn and stained with the dirt and her own blood, her face a canvas of bruises and cuts, so swollen that her features were nearly unrecognizable. But it was her eyes that seized him. In their depths, a universe of pain and defiance still flickered, a resilient ember in the ashes of her ruin. Curled against her, nestled in the tatters of her skirt, were not one, but two impossibly small infants, their faces pinched with hunger, their tiny fists clenched as if in protest against the cruelty of their entry into the world. The woman tried to shield them as he approached, a low, animalistic growl rumbling in her throat, a mother's last stand. Elias stopped, holding up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace he hadn't made in a decade. His voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. "I'm not going to hurt you." She watched him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every line of her body screaming mistrust. He saw the marks on her body not just as injuries, but as a story written in violence, a story of a profound betrayal. In that moment, the solitude he had so carefully cultivated felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. He uncorked his canteen, the water precious in this scorched land, and knelt, offering it to her. She stared at it, then at him, her gaze searching for the lie, the hook hidden within the kindness. Seeing none, she reached out with a trembling hand and drank, the water spilling down her chin. He looked from her broken form to the two small lives she was protecting, and a decision formed, not in his mind, but in a deeper, more elemental part of him. It was a choice that would shatter the careful, sterile peace of his existence. He stood up, his tall frame casting a long shadow over them, a shield against the brutal sun. The words that came next were not planned, but they were as true and solid as the rock beneath his feet. "You're coming with me." The journey back to the cabin was a slow, deliberate pilgrimage. Elias had lifted the woman, Alara, as he would later learn her name was, onto his horse, her slight weight almost nothing against the animal's powerful frame. He then gathered the two infants, swaddled in the remnants of a blanket, into his own arms, their fragile warmth a startling, terrifying sensation against his chest. He walked, leading the horse, his every step measured, a stark contrast to the turmoil that had begun to churn within him. The cabin, upon their arrival, seemed to mock him with its stark masculinity, the air thick with the scent of old leather, wood smoke, and a decade of loneliness. It was a place built for one, a sanctuary of solitude that now had to become a haven for three. Alara slid from the horse, her legs nearly buckling, but she refused his steadying hand, her pride a steel rod holding her upright despite her brokenness. Inside, she stood in the center of the single room, her eyes taking in the Spartan furnishings, the narrow bed, the stone fireplace, the rough-hewn table with its single chair. It was a place devoid of comfort, a space that spoke of a life pared down to mere survival. He laid the twin girls, Mara and Lyra, on his own bed, the only soft place in the entire structure, their tiny forms looking impossibly vulnerable against the coarse wool blanket. Alara watched his every move, her body tense like a cornered animal, flinching when he moved too quickly, her gaze darting towards the door as if plotting an escape she lacked the strength to execute. The silence was different now. It was no longer the empty, echoing silence of his own making, but a heavy, charged silence, thick with unspoken questions and deep-seated fear. He moved about the space with a slow, deliberate grace, tending the fire, putting a pot of water on to heat. His hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard labor, were surprisingly gentle as he prepared a poultice of herbs. When he approached her with it, she shrank back, her eyes wide with a terror that spoke of past brutalities. "Let me help," he said, his voice low, trying to strip it of any command. She shook her head, a small, defiant gesture. He didn't press, merely set the bowl and a clean rag on the table beside her. "The water is hot." "For them," he said, nodding toward the sleeping infants. "They'll need to be cleaned." He then turned his back on her, a deliberate act of trust, and busied himself with chores on the far side of the room, giving her space, a commodity he suspected she hadn't been afforded in a long, long time. Hours later, as the light began to fade, he saw that she had used the poultice on her worst cuts and had gently cleaned her daughters. She had not eaten the food he'd left for her, but she had crumbled a piece of hardtack into a little water and was painstakingly feeding the infants tiny, soaked morsels with her finger. Her focus was absolute, her movements economical and precise. She was not a guest, she was a survivor, already assessing her new, precarious reality. That night, he gave her the bed and slept on the floor by the hearth, a rifle within arm's reach. He did not know what danger had driven her into the wilderness, but he knew with a bone-deep certainty that it was not over. As he lay there, listening to the soft, unfamiliar sounds of 3 other people breathing in his home, Elias Thorne realized the walls he had built around his heart were not nearly as impenetrable as he had believed. The days that followed unfolded in a fragile, unspoken truce. Alara's body began to heal, the deep purple of her bruises fading to a sickly yellow, the cuts slowly scabbing over. But the wounds within were far deeper, revealed in the way she moved silently along the walls of the cabin, never taking up too much space, and the way she would startle at the sound of his boots on the floorboards. She spoke little, and when she did, her voice was a near whisper, as if afraid to draw attention to herself. Yet, she was not idle. From the second day, she insisted on contributing, her actions a quiet declaration that she would not be a burden. She took over the small vegetable patch behind the cabin, a patch Elias had long neglected, and with a focus that was almost reverent, she began to coax life back into the soil, her fingers gently clearing weeds and loosening the earth. She found his mending kit and began repairing the tears in his work shirts, her stitches small and neat, a testament to a life that had known domesticity before it had known horror. Elias watched her, his own silence a cloak he was not yet ready to shed. He would leave a bucket of fresh milk on the doorstep each morning, and in the evening, he would find a portion of his dinner set aside for him on the hearth, warmer than the rest. It was a wordless conversation, a negotiation of boundaries and needs. The presence of the twins, Mara and Lyra, began to subtly alter the very atmosphere of the ranch. Their intermittent cries and soft coos were a new kind of music, a sound of pure, unadulterated life that pushed back against the ever-present wind. Elias found himself mesmerized by them. He had forgotten the sheer perfection of a baby's hand, the way it would instinctively curl around his rough finger. One afternoon, while Alara was outside, he sat by the bed where they slept and, with his whittling knife, began to carve a piece of scrap pine. The shape that emerged slowly and without conscious thought was a small, smooth bird, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. He left it on the blanket between the 2 sleeping infants, a silent offering, a symbol of a freedom he hoped this place could one day represent for them. He saw Alara notice it later, her fingers tracing its smooth contours, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. It was the first object of beauty to enter the cabin in a decade. The piece, however, was a fragile thing. Nightmares were Alara's constant companions. She would cry out in her sleep, small, muffled sounds of terror that brought Elias bolt upright from his place on the floor. He never went to her, sensing that his presence would only heighten her fear, but he would lie awake for hours afterward, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle, a cold fury building in his gut against the faceless man who had haunted her dreams. Her past was a shadow that stretched all the way to his door, and he knew, with the grim certainty of a man who understood violence, that eventually, that shadow would bring its owner with it. The fortress of his solitude had been breached, not by force, but by the quiet resilience of a broken woman and the innocent need of her 2 children. The story of her past emerged in fragments, shards of a shattered life offered up in the quiet hours of the evening as the fire crackled and the twins slept. Her husband, Silas, was a preacher, a man whose piety was a cloak for a profound cruelty. He led a small, isolated community in a valley a few days' ride away, a place where his word was law and scripture was a weapon. Alara had been a dutiful wife, her spirit slowly eroded by his rigid control and suffocating righteousness. The birth of twin girls, however, had been an unforgivable sin in his eyes, an omen of impurity, a mark of a woman's inherent wickedness. He had called it a curse from God, and the community, swayed by his venomous charisma, had agreed. The beatings had begun then, not in anger, but with a cold, methodical purpose he called purification. He was not trying to hurt her, he claimed. He was trying to beat the sin out of her. The final, brutal assault had come after she was discovered trying to flee with the babies. He and 2 other men from the congregation had dragged her to the edge of the community's land and left her for dead, a final, public act of casting out the unclean. He said the wilderness would claim its own, she whispered one night, her voice devoid of self-pity, stating it as a simple, terrible fact, that God would pass his final judgment in the dust. The telling of it did not bring her to tears. Instead, a cold, hard resolve seemed to settle in her features. She was not just a survivor. She was a fugitive from a fanaticism that saw her very existence, and that of her daughters, as an abomination. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but inside, a forge of protective rage was being stoked to a white heat. The faceless antagonist of her nightmares now had a name, Silas. And Silas was not a man who would be content with her disappearance. For a man like that, a man whose power was built on the perception of his unshakable authority, an escaped sinner was a loose thread that could unravel everything. Elias began to see the vast, empty land around his ranch not as a symbol of his isolation, but as a buffer, a defense. The harshness of the terrain, which had once seemed a reflection of his inner state, was now an ally. He began to ride the perimeter of his property daily, his eyes scanning for any sign of riders, his senses on high alert. He started spending his evenings cleaning his firearms, the metallic scrape and click a grimly reassuring sound in the quiet cabin. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a guardian. The change in their dynamic was subtle but profound. He started teaching her to shoot, not the heavy rifle, but a smaller handgun he kept. He didn't just hand it to her, he explained the mechanics, the feel of it, the respect it demanded. "It's a tool," he'd said, his voice steady, "like a hammer or an axe. You need to know how to use it, not to seek out trouble, but to end it if it finds you." She learned quickly, her hands steady, her gaze focused. There was no fear in her, only a grim determination. She was forging herself into a weapon, not of aggression, but of survival. The fragile peace was over, replaced by a shared understanding of the coming storm. The silence in the cabin was no longer just quiet, it was watchful. The monotonous rhythm of ranch life began to weave them together, forging a strange and resilient domesticity in the face of the looming threat. The cabin, once a monument to Elias's grief, was slowly being reclaimed by life. The scent of baking bread now mingled with the familiar smell of wood smoke, a scent that stirred memories Elias had long kept buried. Alara had found a small stash of his late wife's things packed away in a wooden chest in the loft. A few dresses, a book of pressed flowers, and a packet of yeast. She had asked his permission with her eyes before using it, and he had simply nodded, unable to voice the complex storm of emotions the act unleashed within him. It was a ghost of a past life mingling with the fragile hope of a new one. The twins, Mara and Lyra, were the anchors of this new reality. They were growing, their features losing their pinched, starved look, their eyes now bright with curiosity. Their laughter, when it came, was a startlingly pure sound that seemed to scrub the corners of the cabin clean of its sorrow. Elias found his gaze drawn to them constantly. He would watch as Alara bathed them in a small wooden tub, her movements gentle and sure, and a powerful, protective instinct would surge through him, so fierce it was almost painful. He was no longer just protecting a stranger, he was defending a family. He started speaking more, the words coming easier now, filling the silence not with noise, but with connection. He told Alara the names of the constellations he had once traced in the sky with his own wife, Sarah. He spoke of the harshness of the first winter he had spent here alone, and the way the land tested a man, stripping him down to his core. In return, she shared small memories of her life before Silas, of a mother who taught her to identify wild herbs, and a father who told her stories of the stars. They were two solitary people, sharing the maps of their past wounds, discovering that the geography of their pain was not so different. A trip to the dusty settlement that passed for a town, a full day's ride away, became a necessity. Their supplies were dwindling, and the girls needed warmer clothes as the nights grew colder. The journey was tense. Elias rode with the rifle across his lap, Alara beside him on a gentler mare from his stable, the twins bundled into slings against her chest. In the town, their presence created a ripple of curiosity and suspicion. A single man, grim and silent as the grave, with a bruised woman and two infants, was a story people were eager to write for themselves. The stairs followed them from the general store to the blacksmith. Men looked at Alara with a mixture of pity and predatory interest, and at Elias with a challenging glare. He ignored them all, his face a granite mask, his hand never straying far from the pistol at his hip. He bought flour, salt, 2 small wool blankets, and a bag of penny candy, which he pressed into Alara's hand without a word. It was a small, clumsy gesture of tenderness, an acknowledgement of the sweetness her daughters had brought back into his world. The ride home was silent, but it was a different kind of silence, the silence of a shared ordeal, of a line drawn against the outside world. When they crested the final rise and saw the small, sturdy cabin standing against the twilight, it looked less like a place of isolation and more like a sanctuary. It was their fortress. It was home. The fragile equilibrium of their lives was shattered by a child's fever. It started with Lyra, a flush on her cheeks and a listlessness in her movements that quickly escalated into a frightening heat that seemed to consume her small body. Alara's composure, the stoic resilience she had worn like armor, cracked. The fear in her eyes was primal, a terror that went beyond the threat of any man. This was a battle against a foe she could not fight with a rifle or her wits. It was a fight against the unforgiving nature of life itself. The weather, as if sensing the turmoil within the cabin, turned. The sky, which had been a clear, indifferent blue, bruised to a dark purple, and a cold, driving rain began to lash against the windows. The wind howled, no longer a lonely chorus, but a raging scream. The storm was a perfect metaphor for the tempest of fear and helplessness that had engulfed their small sanctuary. Elias knew that the simple remedies they had were not enough. He remembered a doctor, a crusty but competent man, in a settlement a half-day's ride away, further than the town they had visited. To go meant riding through the storm, a treacherous journey through muddy tracks and swollen creeks. To stay meant watching the child fade. There was no choice. He looked at Alara, who was sponging Lyra's forehead with a cool cloth, her face a mask of desperate concentration. "I'll be back before dawn," he said, the words a solemn vow. She just nodded, her eyes never leaving her daughter. The ride was a brutal ordeal, a battle against the elements. The wind tore at him, the rain blinding him, and his horse slipped and stumbled in the slick mud. But Elias rode with a singular, desperate focus. He was no longer just riding for a stranger's child. He was riding for a light that had been rekindled in the darkness of his own life. The thought of that light being extinguished was an agony he could not bear. He pushed the horse and himself to the limits of their endurance, fueled by a fear more profound than any he had known in years. Back in the cabin, Alara held vigil. She cradled Lyra, whispering stories and promises into her ear, her voice a low, steady murmur against the roar of the storm. She was alone, surrounded by a raging tempest outside and a silent, terrifying one within. But she was not broken. Every moment of her focus, every gentle touch, was an act of defiance, a refusal to surrender to the darkness. When Elias finally returned, just as the first gray light of dawn was breaking through the clouds, he was a specter of mud and exhaustion. He stumbled into the cabin, clutching a small bottle of medicine, his face haggard. He saw Alara, still by the child's side, her own face pale and drawn. He knelt beside them, his hand coming to rest on Lyra's forehead. The heat was still fierce. He administered the medicine with a trembling hand, and then there was nothing to do but wait. He and Alara sat together in the dim light, the storm outside beginning to recede, their shoulders almost touching, two solitary souls bound together by a shared vigil. In the crucible of that long, terrifying night, the final walls between them had dissolved, washed away by the storm and the shared terror of losing a child. When the fever finally broke, and Lyra's breathing eased into a peaceful sleep. The relief was so immense it was a physical force, leaving them both drained and trembling. The crisis had passed, and in its wake, something new and unbreakable had been forged. The fragile peace that followed Lyra's recovery was the calm before the inevitable storm. The world outside their small valley had not forgotten them. A traveling tinker, seeking shelter from the rain, had stopped at Silas's settlement and spoken of a grim rancher living in isolation with a woman and twin infants who matched Lyra's description. For Silas, this was not just news, it was a divine sign, a call to action. His property had been found, his authority challenged. The woman who embodied his shame was alive, her existence a testament to his failure to enforce God's judgment. He could not let it stand. His power was absolute only as long as it was seen as such. He began to preach with a renewed fire, his sermons twisting scripture into a mandate for violence. He spoke of a den of sin in the wilderness, of a righteous duty to reclaim a fallen woman and purify the land of the sinner who harbored her. He painted Elias as a demon, a corrupter, and Lyra as a vessel of wickedness who had lured him into her web. To his congregation, hardened and isolated people who clung to his certainty as a shield against a chaotic world, his words were a clarion call. He was not just gathering men, he was summoning a holy mob. Word of the coming threat reached the ranch on the wings of the wind, carried by a nervous trapper who sometimes traded pelts with Elias, and who had heard the talk in Silas's valley. "He's coming for her, Thorn," the trapper had warned, his eyes wide with fear. "He's got a dozen men with him, and they're calling it a crusade." The news landed not with a shock, but with a grim, heavy finality. The slow burn of their anxiety was over. The confrontation they had both been silently preparing for was now at their doorstep. Elias's response was not one of panic, but of cold, methodical preparation. The ranch, once his prison of solitude, was now a fortress to be defended. He and Lyra worked together, their movements synchronized by a shared, unspoken purpose. They boarded up the smaller windows, reinforced the door, and created strategic points of defense. The land that he knew so intimately became a weapon. He knew every rock, every gully, every line of sight. He walked Lyra through it all, his voice low and steady as he explained his plan. There was no fear in her, only a cold, focused anger. The woman who had been left to die in the dust was gone. In her place stood a mother who would burn the world down to protect her children. She cleaned and loaded the handgun he had given her, her movements precise and economical. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a soldier preparing for battle. The nights leading up to the confrontation were filled with a taut, electric silence. They would sit by the fire, the twins sleeping peacefully in a makeshift cradle, their innocence a stark contrast to the violence that was coming. Elias found himself looking at Lyra, at the strength etched into the lines of her face, and realized that his fight was not born of pity or even duty. He was fighting for her, for the quiet dignity with which she had reclaimed her life, for the way she had walked into the barren landscape of his existence and made it bloom. He was fighting for his home, a home he hadn't realized he'd found until it was threatened. The coming storm was not just about survival. It was about defending the fragile, beautiful life they had built together in the ruins of their pasts. The arrival of Silas and his men was not a thunderous charge, but a slow, arrogant procession. They rode out of the morning mist like wraiths, their faces grim and self-righteous, convinced of their divine mandate. They stopped just beyond rifle range, a dark stain against the pale landscape. Silas sat upon a tall, black horse, his Bible held aloft like a standard. He was a man made imposing not by his physical stature, but by the sheer, unwavering force of his conviction. The confrontation began not with bullets, but with words, Silas's voice rolling across the distance, dripping with venomous piety. "Sinner, I have come to reclaim the vessel of your corruption. Send out the woman, and the Lord may yet have mercy on your blackened soul." Elias stood on the porch of the cabin, his rifle held loosely in his hands, his body relaxed but ready. He did not shout back. He let the man's words hang in the air, revealing their own hollow fanaticism. Beside him, just inside the doorway, Lyra watched, her face a mask of cold fury, the handgun held steady at her side. Elias's reply, when it came, was quiet, direct, and absolute. "This is her home now. Ride on." This simple denial of his authority seemed to enrage Silas more than any insult. "She is my wife, bound to me by God. She is cursed property, and I will have her back." He spurred his horse forward, and his men began to advance, their confidence absolute. The first shot was not fired by Elias. It came from a man to Silas's right, a nervous zealot who raised his rifle and fired wildly at the cabin. The bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe, inches from where Alara stood. That was the moment the tense standoff shattered into violence. The fight was not a prolonged battle. It was a swift, brutal, and decisive clash, as per the rules of this land. Elias was not a soldier, but a man defending his home, and he moved with an efficiency born of desperation and deep familiarity with his terrain. He fired twice, not to kill, but to disable, his shots taking two of the men's horses down and sending their riders tumbling into the dust. The confident advance faltered, turning into a chaotic scramble. As the men struggled, another tried to rush the porch from the side. But he hadn't counted on Alara. She stepped out from the doorway, her stance solid, her aim unwavering. She fired once. The handgun bucked in her hand, and the man cried out, dropping his rifle as he clutched a wounded shoulder. He stared at her, not with anger, but with sheer, stunned disbelief. The broken, beaten woman he had helped cast out was gone. In her place was a figure of righteous fury, a protector. The sight of his cursed wife, not cowering but fighting back with deadly competence, seemed to shatter Silas's messianic certainty. His crusade was built on her weakness, on her victimhood. Her strength was a refutation of his entire worldview. He stared at her, his face a mixture of fury and fear. In that moment of hesitation, Elias closed the distance, his own face a grim testament to a quiet, dangerous rage. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't need to. He stood before Silas, a man of the earth against a man of empty words, and the preacher's fanaticism finally crumbled under the weight of a simple, unshakable truth. "She is not yours," Elias said, his voice low and final. Defeated not by bullets, but by a courage he could not comprehend, Silas turned his horse and fled, his remaining men scrambling after him, a pathetic, broken mob. The threat was over. The silence that descended in their wake was profound, broken only by the cry of a hawk circling in the clear, empty sky. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It was not the heavy silence of loneliness or the taut silence of fear, but a deep, resonant peace. The violence had been a cleansing fire, burning away the last vestiges of their old lives, the final ghosts of Silas and the past. They did not speak of what had happened. There was no need. The shared danger, the way they had stood together, had said everything that words could not. Their bond had been forged in the crucible, and it was now unbreakable. The days that followed were about the slow, deliberate work of healing and building. Elias helped Alara tend to the small garden, his large hands, which had so recently held a rifle with deadly intent, now gentle as they cleared stones from the soil. She, in turn, began to truly make the cabin a home, not just a shelter. She hung dried herbs from the rafters and placed a jar of wildflowers on the rough-hewn table. The small, carved bird Elias had made for the twins now sat on the mantelpiece, a permanent symbol of their new beginning. The landscape itself seemed to change. The harsh, unforgiving plains now seemed possessed of a stark and profound beauty. The sunsets, which Elias had once watched with a vacant ache, were now a shared spectacle, a moment of quiet communion as they sat on the porch, the twins playing at their feet. The wind no longer sounded like a mournful cry, but like a whisper of promise. One evening, as they watched the sky bleed from orange to purple, Elias turned to her. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking the back of it. It was the first time he had touched her with such open, gentle affection. "This is your home now, Alara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "If you'll have it." She looked at him, her eyes shining in the twilight, and a true, unguarded smile graced her lips for the first time. She intertwined her fingers with his, a simple gesture that was both an answer and a vow. "Our home," she corrected softly. The extended resolution of their story was not in grand declarations, but in the small, everyday moments of a life being built together. It was in the easy way they moved around each other in the small cabin, in the shared laughter over the twins' clumsy first steps, in the comfortable silence that spoke of a deep and abiding understanding. The stoic, wounded hero had found a reason to let his heart beat again. The resilient survivor had found a place of safety where she could finally lay down her armor. And the two infant girls, who had been born into a world of judgment and violence, would now grow up in a home defined by courage, acceptance, and a quiet, powerful love. The solitary rancher was no longer lonely, and the woman who had been beaten for her children had found not just a sanctuary, but a family. The wilderness had not claimed her, it had saved her. And in saving her, it had saved him too. The story of Elias and Alara is more than just a tale of survival in a harsh and unforgiving world. It is a testament to the quiet strength of the human spirit and the transformative power of compassion. It reminds us that even in the deepest wells of loneliness and despair, a single act of kindness can be the seed from which a new life can grow. Elias, a man locked away in the prison of his own grief, found his redemption not in forgetting his past, but in opening his heart to the suffering of another. He didn't offer grand speeches or easy promises. He offered safety, respect, and the quiet dignity of choice. Alara, a woman brutalized and cast out for the very act of bringing life into the world, discovered that her strength was not a sin to be punished, but a force capable of rebuilding a shattered existence and defending those she loved. Her resilience was not passive. It was an active, creative force that turned a desolate shelter into a loving home. And the twin girls, Mara and Lyra, catalysts of both the conflict and the healing, represent the profound truth that new life, in all its innocence and vulnerability, holds the power to break down the most formidable walls we build around ourselves. Their story shows us that a home is not merely a structure of wood and stone, but a space forged by mutual protection, shared vulnerability, and the courageous choice to trust again. It is a powerful narrative about how two broken people, and the children who brought them together, can face down the darkness of the world and find not just a sanctuary, but a family, proving that the most profound acts of heroism are often the quietest ones. If this story of courage and redemption resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales that explore the depths of the human heart.